Welcome, dear listeners, to another case from Midnight Mystery Hub. Today, we begin a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, The Mystery of the Poisoned Ink. It was a particularly bleak afternoon in early November of the year 1898 when the matter of the poisoned ink first came to our attention at Baker Street. The fog had settled upon London with a persistence that suggested it had taken up permanent residence, and I had spent the better part of the morning attempting to keep warm by the fire, while Holmes maintained his characteristic silence in the chair opposite, his lean frame stretched out in that languid posture which invariably indicated he was deep in thought or deep in boredom. I could never quite determine which. I was putting down my newspaper when Holmes suddenly spoke, his eyes remaining closed and his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "A government official, Watson, in considerable distress. He approaches our stairs even now, his step hesitant yet urgent. I detect the faint odor of sealing wax and official correspondence about his person, and his shoes, though I cannot see them, bear the distinctive click of regulation-issue leather worn by those who frequent Whitehall." I confess I started at this pronouncement, for I had heard nothing. Yet within seconds Mrs. Hudson's knock upon the door confirmed Holmes' prediction, and a moment later our visitor was shown into the room. The gentleman who entered was indeed a man of middling years, with the sallow complexion of one who spends his days in dimly lit offices, and the slightly stooped shoulders that speak to a lifetime bent over papers. He wore a black coat of fine quality, though somewhat worn at the cuffs, and carried a leather document case clutched to his chest, as though it contained state secrets, which, as matters transpired, it very nearly did. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his voice betraying the same agitation which his bearing suggested. "I am he," Holmes replied, opening his eyes with the languid grace of a cat awakening from its nap. "You are Mr. Harold Pemberton, I presume, of the Foreign Office. The matter which brings you here involves 3 deaths, all occurring within the past fortnight, all men of distinguished physician, and all connected, though how you cannot yet fathom, by correspondence written in a particular ink." Pemberton's document case fell from his hands and struck the carpet with a dull thud. His face, already pale, took on the color of fresh parchment. "How could you possibly—" "It is my business to know, Mr. Pemberton," Holmes interrupted, gesturing toward the chair I had already vacated for our visitor. "Please, sit. Dr. Watson will pour you some brandy, you look as though you need it, and then you will tell us everything." I procured the requested restorative from the sideboard and pressed it into Pemberton's trembling hands. After a generous swallow, he seemed to recover some measure of himself. "You have heard of the death of Sir Edwin Ashworth," he began. "The industrialist who perished at his club a week ago Tuesday. The papers reported it as a heart condition, though the man was renowned for his robust constitution. And Lord Pembroke, the senior diplomat, found dead in his study 3 days later. The official verdict was apoplexy brought on by overwork. And Mr. Samuel Blackwood, the Under-Secretary of State? Discovered deceased in his bed yesterday morning, I believe. Natural causes were cited." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that particular brightness I had come to recognize as the awakening of his professional interest. 3 men, each prominent in his sphere, each apparently felled by ordinary maladies, yet you come to me, Mr. Pemberton, which suggests you do not believe these deaths to be natural in the least." Pemberton produced a white handkerchief and mopped his brow. "They were murdered, Mr. Holmes, I am certain of it, and I believe I may be next." It took the better part of an hour for Pemberton to unfold his narrative, and I shall endeavor to reproduce it here with the brevity Holmes himself would have preferred, though I suspect I shall fail to achieve his economy of words. "The connection between these men," Pemberton explained, "lies in a confidential committee upon which we all served. The investigation into the Caledonia trade agreements. You may have read something of the scandal in the newspapers some months past." Holmes nodded. The diverting of several £100,000 from the colonial budget into private accounts, a most ingenious fraud, as I recall. The investigation concluded with the arrest and imprisonment of 3 officials, but there was always a suspicion that a 4th conspirator existed, someone higher in the chain of authority who orchestrated the scheme while others took the risks. The 4 of us were appointed to a confidential review board to determine whether the investigation should be reopened, and if so, in what manner. And your conclusion? We had concluded our deliberations. Our report, recommending further investigation and naming our suspicions, was dispatched to the Prime Minister's office 1 week ago. Pemberton paused significantly. It was written in my hand, using ink from my own desk, the same ink with which I had written to each of my fellow committee members and to a gentleman whom I suspect may be the 4th conspirator, informing him of our intentions. Within 48 hours, 3 of my colleagues were dead. Holmes had risen and was pacing before the fire, his long fingers pressed together. The symptoms observed in the deceased, were they consistent across all 3 cases? That is what is so puzzling, Pemberton replied. Sir Edwin Ashworth complained of numbness in his fingers following dinner at his club, then collapsed with paralysis of the respiratory system. Lord Pembroke was found with a severe rash on his face and convulsions. Mr. Samuel Blackwood simply failed to wake, a peaceful death by appearance, but the attending physician noted unusual discoloration of the fingernails. 3 different symptoms, yet you suspect a common cause? I suspect the ink, Mr. Holmes, for I have examined the bottles upon my desk with some care, and I discover that one, the green ink which I used for those particular letters, contains some foreign substance. The odor is faintly acidic, and there are particles suspended in the fluid that should not be there. Holmes ceased his pacing and turned upon our visitor with sudden intensity. You have brought this ink. I have brought everything. Pemberton retrieved his document case and extracted several items wrapped in cloth, 3 bottles of ink, red, blue, and green, a sheaf of correspondence, and what appeared to be a blank sheet of paper. The green bottle, he said, his finger trembling as he pointed, that is the poison. Holmes took the bottle to the window and held it to the pale light struggling through the fog. Curious, most curious. Watson, your magnifying glass, if you please. I procured the instrument, and Holmes subjected the bottle to minute examination. The manufacturer is Hippolyte et Fils of Paris, makers of fine inks to the diplomat corps. The seal appears intact, yet you say you purchased this yourself? From Harding's stationery on the Strand, some 6 months ago. I have used it without incident until these recent letters. And the letters themselves? I have kept carbon copies. Pemberton unfolded the sheaf of papers. Each was written upon my personal stationery, sealed with my personal seal, and dispatched by my own servant. Holmes took the papers and examined them with his glass, his expression growing more grave with each passing moment. Most interesting, he muttered, more to himself than to us. Most interesting indeed. What do you see? I asked. I see death, Watson, death rendered in cursive script upon fine paper. He pointed to the green-inked text. Observe the slight crystallization at the edges of the letters where the ink has dried, a peculiarity which suggests the presence of metallic salts in suspension. And here, he indicated several minute spots upon the paper, traces of a clear fluid, perhaps water, which has caused the ink to run slightly. This letter to Sir Edwin was written with a wet pen or upon paper that was dampened. I don't understand, Pemberton said. Nor do I, Mr. Pemberton, not yet, but I shall. In the meantime, you must consider yourself in the gravest danger. I see from the condition of your fingernails that you have used this ink yourself. The color drained from Pemberton's face. He examined his hands with horror. I have written several letters today, preparing my affairs in case you should meet the same fate as your colleagues, Holmes finished grimly. Watson, your medical expertise is required. What do you observe? I examined Pemberton's hands and found, to my alarm, the very beginnings of discoloration beneath the fingernails, a faint bluish tinge that suggested cyanosis or the presence of some toxic agent in the bloodstream. Have you experienced any numbness, any tingling in the extremities? My fingers have been somewhat cold, Pemberton admitted, but I attributed it to the weather. The poison acts slowly, Holmes observed, perhaps because it is absorbed through the skin rather than ingested. That would explain the varied symptoms, different concentrations absorbed at different rates depending upon the handling of the letters by their recipients. Can anything be done? Watson, we must take Mr. Pemberton to a specialist immediately. Dr. Moore at St. Bartholomew's has particular expertise in toxic substances. Holmes scribbled a hasty note and pressed it into my hands. Take him there at once. I shall remain here and examine the physical evidence more closely. As I helped Pemberton to his feet, he had begun to shake visibly. I could not help but question Holmes's apparent calm in the face of this deadly business. But I knew from experience that his mind was already at work, turning over possibilities, examining hypotheses, pursuing threads of logic invisible to ordinary understanding. I returned from St. Bartholomew's some 3 hours later, having seen Pemberton settled into a private room where Dr. Moore could observe him and, if necessary, attempt the extraction of the poison from his system. The snow had begun to fall during my absence, adding a certain melancholy to the London streets that seemed appropriate to the grim business at hand. I found Holmes exactly where I had left him, surrounded by a laboratory of improvised equipment. The poisoned ink had been distributed among several glass slides and petri dishes. Chemical reagents stood in rank upon the table, and the air was thick with fumes that made my eyes water. "Holmes," I coughed, "you will asphyxiate yourself with these vapors." "A small price to pay for knowledge, my dear fellow." Holmes did not look up from his microscope. "I have identified the agent. It is a particularly insidious compound, mercury fulminate suspended in a solution of potassium cyanide, rendered stable by the addition of gum arabic. The ink itself serves as a carrier, but the poison is activated by moisture. A damp pen, a humid day, perhaps even the moisture of a recipient's fingers upon the paper, any of these would release the toxins. Murder by correspondence, diabolical. Indeed, the mixture is sophisticated, Watson, far more sophisticated than one would expect from an ordinary criminal. It requires knowledge of chemistry, certainly, but also of calligraphy and paper. The poison must be evenly suspended, yet invisible to the eye. The consistency of the ink must remain such that it flows properly from a nib. This was prepared by someone who understands the needs of a diplomatic correspondent. A fellow government official? Or someone with access to their supplies? Holmes sat back in his chair and lit his pipe, a sure sign that he had reached a point in his deliberations where he required the meditative properties of tobacco. "We must consider the question of motive. 3 men are dead, a 4th poisoned. All served on a committee investigating a financial scandal affecting the Caledonia trade agreements. They had completed their report and were prepared to name a 4th conspirator, a shadow figure who orchestrated the original fraud. Pemberton mentioned writing to such a person. Precisely, and whoever this person is, they possessed the knowledge, the access, and the ruthlessness to eliminate those who threatened to expose them." Holmes blew a perfect smoke ring that ascended toward the ceiling. "But here is what puzzles me, Watson. The poison was in Pemberton's own ink bottle, ink he had possessed for 6 months. Who could have introduced the toxin, and when? A servant? Possibly, though the substitution would require knowledge of which ink bottle to choose. Pemberton himself, perhaps, under some form of coercion? He seemed genuinely frightened. Fear can be simulated, or he may be frightened not of death, but of exposure." Holmes rose suddenly, his energy restored. "We must visit Harding's stationery to learn what we can of the ink's provenance. But first, I must send a telegram to an old friend at the Foreign Office." He scribbled furiously at his desk while I dressed for the weather, securing my coat against the promise of deeper snow. Within 20 minutes, we were navigating the streets in a hansom cab. Holmes silent and withdrawn into thought. Harding's Stationery proved to be a venerable establishment occupying a narrow storefront on the Strand, its windows filled with displays of writing implements, leather-bound ledgers, and bottles of ink arranged like soldiers on parade. The proprietor, a Mr. Josiah Harding, was a man of approximately 60 years, with a dignified bearing of one who considers himself a guardian of civilization's written record rather than a mere shopkeeper. "Mr. Holmes," he said, recognizing my companion at once, "I have read your exploits in the Strand magazine. It is an honor, sir, to have you in my humble establishment." "The honor is mine, Mr. Harding. I come on a matter of some delicacy, involving a purchase made by one of your regular customers, Mr. Harold Pemberton, of the Foreign Office." Harding's expression grew guarded. "I do not discuss my customers' affairs, Mr. Holmes. Confidentiality is the foundation of my profession. And murder is the foundation of this inquiry." Holmes produced a florin and placed it on the counter, a gesture which seemed both generous and oddly menacing. "I require information about the green ink manufactured by Hippolyte and Fils, purchased by Mr. Pemberton some 6 months past." The coin disappeared into Harding's pocket, though his scruples apparently remained. "Mr. Pemberton is a valued customer. He purchases his supplies here regularly, as do many gentlemen of his station. The green ink in question, Hippolyte's Emerald Shade, is a premium product, much favored by those who require a distinctive hand. When did he last purchase it?" "I should have to consult my ledger." Harding produced a massive book from beneath the counter and ran his finger down the entries. "Yes, here. March the 14th, 1 bottle of Emerald Shade, 2 quarts of black copying ink, a gross of his customary stationery." "And since then?" "He has returned twice for black ink and once for additional stationery, but not for the green. 1 bottle lasts him several months." Holmes leaned forward. "When you say he has returned, Mr. Harding, do you mean he has returned personally, or has he sent a servant?" "Most often he sends his man. Bentley, I believe the fellow is called. A thin chap with a permanent scowl. He collects Mr. Pemberton's regular order every fortnight." "And has Bentley collected anything within the past week?" Harding consulted his ledger once more. "Monday last, a bottle of black ink and sealing wax. Nothing unusual." "You are certain?" "Positive, Mr. Holmes. I make the entries myself." We took our leave of Harding with little more than we had entered with, save for a growing conviction that the answer to our mystery lay closer to Pemberton's household than to his place of business. "The servant, Bentley," Holmes said as we emerged into the snow-filled street. "He has access to Pemberton's supplies, knowledge of his habits, and opportunity to substitute the poisoned ink. But the question remains, motive. Why should a servant conspire in the murder of his master and 3 other gentlemen of high station? Perhaps he was paid." "Undoubtedly he was paid, Watson, but by whom? Who possesses both the means to pay such a servant and the knowledge to create the poisoned ink? We must pay a visit to Mr. Pemberton's residence." Mr. Pemberton's house occupied a respectable address in Chelsea, a 4-story townhouse of white stone with a bow window upon the first floor and a brass knocker that gleamed even through the settling snow. A maid admitted us, explaining that Mrs. Pemberton was at home, but that the master of the house was, as we well knew, presently indisposed at St. Bartholomew's. "We are aware," Holmes said, producing his card. "We come on a matter most urgent regarding Mr. Pemberton's illness. Might we have a word with the servant, Bentley?" The maid showed us into a parlor, furnished in the heavy taste of the previous generation, then departed to fetch the man in question. Bentley proved to be exactly as Harding had described, a thin, sallow-faced man with a perpetual expression of discontent and hands that seemed never to rest, as though they constantly sought occupation. "I understand you do the marketing for Mr. Pemberton's stationery," Holmes began. "Yes, sir. Every fortnight, regular as clockwork. including a visit to Harding's this past Monday?" The servant's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's right, black ink and sealing wax." "Did you also, by any chance, replace a bottle of green ink in his desk?" If I had not been watching Bentley closely, I might have missed the slight hesitation, the fractional tightening of his jaw. "No, sir. The master keeps his green ink special. He replenishes that himself." "I see. And are there others in the household who might have access to Mr. Pemberton's study?" "The master keeps his study locked when he's not within. Mrs. Pemberton has a key, and myself. I am responsible for the cleaning." "And you cleaned the study recently?" "Saturday last, as is my custom." Holmes rose and moved toward the window, his back to our witness. "Saturday, the day before the 5 letters were written. Tell me, Bentley, do you know the nature of the correspondence your master dispatched following your cleaning?" "I don't read the master's letters, sir." "Of course not, but you might have observed the addresses, or overheard Mr. Pemberton discussing the committee of which he was a member, the investigation into the Caledonia fraud. You were in his service when that scandal broke, were you not?" 3 years now, sir." 3 years. Holmes turned suddenly. "And in those 3 years, have you ever heard the name of Lord Alderton?" The effect of this question was extraordinary. Bentley's face went pale as death, and his hands, which had been clasped before him, now clutched at his coat as though seeking support. I don't know the name, sir." "You are lying, Bentley." Holmes's voice had taken on the quality of a whip-clack. "Lord Alderton was the chairman of the Caledonia Trade Authority. He was also the man who dismissed you from his service 5 years ago for suspected theft, the theft of confidential documents, if the records at Scotland Yard are accurate. You were fortunate that he did not prosecute, though I suspect his reasons for leniency had more to do with concealing his own involvement than with Christian charity." This is monstrous," Bentley stammered. "You can't prove any of this." "I can prove that you were seen in conversation with a known associate of Lord Alderton's 1 week ago in a public house near Charing Cross. I can prove that you purchased a chemical compound from a druggist in Lambeth, using a false name but your distinctive handwriting, which is on file with the Metropolitan Police." Holmes advanced upon the trembling servant. "What I cannot yet prove, but fully intend to, is that you substituted the poisoned ink at Lord Alderton's instruction, believing that your revenge on Pemberton would also serve your former master's ends." But I could see that we had pushed too hard, too fast. Bentley's face, momentarily stricken, had now assumed a mask of cunning. "You'll not get me to confess to what I never done. I want a solicitor. I want—" He did not complete his sentence. From the doorway a voice cut through the room with the authority of command. "That will not be necessary, Bentley. I believe I can explain everything." Mrs. Pemberton stood framed in the doorway, a handsome woman of perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair drawn back in a severe chignon, and eyes that burned with an intensity I found most disturbing. "You will forgive me, gentlemen, for eavesdropping upon your interview," Mrs. Pemberton said, entering the room with a composure that seemed entirely at odds with the circumstances. "I had suspected for some time that Bentley was not to be trusted. My husband's illness, his symptoms, I recognized them." "Recognized them, madam?" Holmes asked, producing his card. "From my first husband, Mr. Oliver Blackwood. The late Mr. Blackwood, I should say." She turned to me with a slight nod. "You may recall that Mr. Blackwood was among the victims. He was my husband before Pemberton." I was taken aback by this revelation. "You were married to Samuel Blackwood?" 20 years until his death, from apparently natural causes, in 1994. Mrs. Pemberton's voice was calm, almost detached, as though she were discussing the weather. "His death was not natural, gentlemen. It was murder, and I have spent these 4 years seeking proof of the identity of his killer." Holmes had resumed his seat, his expression intent. Pray continue, Mrs. Pemberton. Samuel discovered the Caledonia fraud shortly before his death. He confided in me that a high-ranking official was involved. Someone's public reputation made accusation impossible without irrefutable proof. Before he could gather that proof, he was poisoned. The method, the discoloration of the nails, the gradual paralysis of the respiratory system, I remembered it all when Pemberton began exhibiting the same symptoms. So you suspected that the same person had attempted to kill your second husband. I suspected that the conspiracy continued and that Pemberton's committee had drawn the same dangerous attention that had doomed Samuel. She reached into her sleeve and produced a letter. I took the liberty, gentlemen, of examining Pemberton's correspondence before he dispatched it. I found this in the waste bin of his study.
Holmes took the letter and read it aloud. My dear Pemberton, you cannot believe that your petty committee poses any threat to me. I have survived worse storms than this. However, since you insist upon pressing this matter, I feel obliged to demonstrate the futility of your position. By the time you read this, your colleagues will have paid the price for your impertinence. As for yourself, I suggest you examine the ink with which you pen your threats. A man in your position cannot afford to soil his reputation with baseless accusations, particularly when the instruments of his office may betray him. The letter was unsigned, but Holmes's eyes were alight. This handwriting, I recognize it. As do I, Mrs. Pemberton replied. It belongs to Lord Alderton. The snow had turned to sleet by the time we reached Lord Alderton's residence in Grosvenor Square, a mansion of imposing dimensions that spoke to generations of accumulated wealth and influence. Our ring was answered by a butler of such perfect impassivity that one might have suspected him of being carved from the same marble as the entrance hall. Lord Alderton was in his study, and we were kept waiting only a brief interval before being admitted into his presence. The man who rose to greet us was perhaps 60 years of age, with the florid complexion of one who eats well and the sharp eyes of one who watches constantly for advantage. He was dressed in a velvet smoking jacket of deep burgundy, and upon the desk behind him stood a crystal decanter of whiskey and 2 glasses. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice resonant with cultivated charm, "I have followed your career with interest, and Dr. Watson, your chronicler, I believe. To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" "The murder of 3 men, Lord Alderton," Holmes replied without preamble, "and the attempted murder of a 4th. Alderton's expression did not change, but I noticed that his hand, reaching for the decanter, trembled slightly. "Strong accusations, Mr. Holmes. I trust you have equally strong evidence." "The evidence is being gathered even now." Holmes moved to the window. "You wrote to Harold Pemberton threatening the lives of his committee members. You had access to his household through your agent, Bentley, and you possess the chemical knowledge, I have confirmed your education at Heidelberg, to have prepared the poisoned ink. And my motive? You were the 4th conspirator in the Caledonia fraud. The investigation of 1895 arrested 3 minor officials, while you, as chairman of the Trade Authority, supervised the inquiry that exonerated yourself. But Pemberton's committee was about to reopen the investigation with new evidence that would have led inexorably to your door." Alderton's persona cracked. His face purpled with rage, and for a moment I thought he would strike Holmes. "You have no right. This is an outrage. I am a peer of the realm. And as a peer, you will be tried by your own kind, though I suspect that even the House of Lords will find your crimes difficult to overlook. 3 men dead, Lord Alderton, 3 men who stood between you and exposure, not to mention the death of Samuel Blackwood 4 years ago, the murder which set Mrs. Pemberton upon her long quest for justice." Alderton collapsed into his chair, all the strength seeming to drain from his limbs. Blackwood was a fool. He would not be bought, would not be silenced. What choice did I have? You could have faced your crimes. Instead, you compounded them. Holmes moved to the door. Inspector Lestrade will be here shortly to take you into custody. I suggest you use the intervening time to consider whether there are any further crimes you wish to confess. The courts may look more favorably upon cooperation. Lord Alderton was indeed arrested that evening, and the search of his bank vault revealed not only the evidence Holmes had predicted, but also a cache of sensitive documents implicating several other officials in the Caledonia fraud. The scandal, when it broke, convulsed Westminster for weeks, though Holmes maintained his characteristic indifference to political sensation. As for Pemberton, he survived his poisoning, thanks largely to Mrs. Pemberton's timely intervention. Upon recognizing the symptoms, she had induced vomiting and summoned medical assistance before the toxin could fully enter his system. Dr. Moore's subsequent treatment, involving the administration of activated charcoal and careful monitoring of his respiratory function, saved his life. Bentley, confronted with the evidence of his complicity, turned King's evidence against his former patron. His testimony regarding Alderton's instructions provided the prosecution with its most damning evidence, and in exchange he received a reduced sentence of 10 years' imprisonment rather than the hanging his crimes would have otherwise merited. I visited Pemberton at his home some 3 weeks later, finding him much recovered in spirits, though still pale and thin. Holmes accompanied me, though he maintained his usual silence during such visits, preferring to observe from a corner. "I owe you both my life," Pemberton said, pressing our hands warmly. "Particularly you, Mr. Holmes. Without your intervention, Alderton would have continued unchecked, and I should have joined my colleagues in death. The credit belongs in part to Mrs. Pemberton. Her recognition of the symptoms and her preservation of that crucial letter made the difference." Pemberton turned to his wife with evident tenderness. "Indeed, I have been most fortunate in my marriage." He paused. "Though I confess I still do not understand how the poison worked. The ink, how could writing with it prove fatal?" Holmes rose and moved to the window, his expression thoughtful. "The poison was suspended in the ink itself, mercury fulminate and potassium cyanide, in a stable compound that would not react until exposed to moisture. When you wrote with the ink, particularly if your pen was damp or the paper humid, the poison transferred to your fingers. It was absorbed through the skin, slowly, over hours or days, depending on the concentration and the sensitivity of the victim." "But the different symptoms?" "The mercury affected the nervous system, causing numbness and paralysis. The cyanide affected the respiratory system and produced the discoloration you observed. The exact mixture of symptoms depended on how much of each component was absorbed and how quickly. Sir Edwin, who wrote frequently and habitually moistened his fingers, absorbed more mercury. Lord Pembroke, who handled the letter only briefly, but scratched his face afterwards, showed the characteristic rash of cyanide poisoning. Mr. Blackwood, who perhaps chewed his pen in thought, ingested enough to kill him outright. And myself? You used the ink sparingly, and your fingers must have been relatively dry. You absorbed just enough to sicken, not enough to kill." Pemberton shuddered. "A diabolical method."
"A method suited to a man of Alderton's temperament," Holmes observed. "He preferred to kill at a distance, to strike without ever being present. The ink was his weapon, the letter his agent of death. He would have watched from his comfortable study as his enemies died, never coming close enough to risk exposure himself. But for Mrs. Pemberton's vigilance—" "Yes," Holmes said, turning to regard the lady with something approaching respect. "Women often observe what men overlook, particularly where matters of the heart are concerned. Mrs. Pemberton's devotion to her first husband's memory compelled her to watch for signs of the same malady. Without that watchfulness, Alderton might have escaped justice entirely." We left Pemberton to his recovery, and the hansom cab deposited us at Baker Street as dusk was falling. Holmes went immediately to his violin, and for an hour the melancholy notes of a Bach partita filled our rooms while I recorded these events in my journal. When he finally set the instrument aside, Holmes spoke. "You are writing the account, Watson?" "I am." "You will call it The Mystery of the Poisoned Ink?" "It seems appropriate." Holmes nodded, gazing into the fire. A lurid title, but accurate. The ink was indeed the mystery, the method, the means, and ultimately the message that led us to Alderton. He fell silent for a moment. "I confess, Watson, I found this case somewhat distasteful. The coldness of the crime, the calculated nature of it, offends my sense of the dramatic. A good murder, if one may speak of such a thing, requires passion. Alderton's murders were merely expedient. Yet we brought him to justice. We did, and 3 men, though they could not be saved, were at least avenged." Holmes rose and stretched. "But now I find myself at loose ends once more. The criminal classes of London, it seems, have chosen to behave themselves." I smiled at his petulance. "I am certain they will oblige you with fresh outrages soon enough. One can only hope, Watson, one can only hope." I set down my pen and joined him at the window. Below, the gas lamps were being lit against the gathering darkness, and the snow-covered streets of London glittered with an almost ethereal beauty. Somewhere in that darkness, I knew, other crimes were being planned, other mysteries waiting to be solved. And beside me stood Sherlock Holmes, ready as always to pursue them.